Anyway, thank you for coming. And so I know at least all of us got a little drizzled, but it didn't hurt us, did it? We might grow. You never know. Anyway, at this time I'd like to have Chris, wherever you are, come and everyone stand. We will pledge the allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And just to remind you, the reason the Friends of the Museum exist, at least simply said, is to foster and to promote understanding of this area and its heritage. And it is rich with it. I would like now to introduce the Friends, the board. Oh, finally, I see some faces I hadn't seen earlier. And please, would you stand and stay up until everyone has been introduced on the board. Well, first of all, Jerry, that's me, Jerry Collette. Okay, Chris Ditmore, he was holding the flag. Paula McFarland, Terry Meeks, way in the back. And Penny McPherson, where are you? There you go. She hung this for you to see. Aaron, there he is, okay. And Ann Zielinski, there she is. So let's give him a hand. And it would be really straight if we didn't introduce to you a top director that this museum has ever had, Lisa Stutz. Lisa, would you introduce those of you, your staff, wherever they might be?
They're in the other room. I can introduce my staff. We have Brandon Maris.
Yes.
Steve Brock, who is our new curator of collections and exhibits. Jessica Ashton, who's our education coordinator.
And you'll hear her on the radio.
Yes. Yep. She does the morning line for KRLN once a month. She also does programs for the Golden Age Center, Star Point, and Garden Park Villa on a regular basis. And Logan Williams, who is our archives librarian, who's back there somewhere.
And each year, there's a few members of the board who their time has kind of come up. And this year's two of us, myself and Paula, would you stand again, please? Okay, who are up, and we've decided we'll give it a couple more years. And so they are nominated. Are there any nominations for the board from the audience? I would say that's pretty quiet. Then all of you who are in favor of these two, myself and Paula, say aye. Aye. Opposed, aye. I guess we're in. Thank you. And of course, one thing that you got to have is some money. So we have to have a treasurer's report. Please give us a treasurer's report. You may come up here.
The last few years have been really good to us. Thanks to all of our members. I'm not going to read the whole thing, that's why I passed out a copy. Let me see, where did I want to go? eyes aren't working either, but anyway, our membership money was down, so we need to work on getting more memberships. Our donations were fantastic. We took in over $14,000 this year. And that is just, to me, phenomenal. We had a few more smaller money makers. The banners that we had used earlier for the 150th celebration, we sold some of those. We have a couple of movies every September. The paleo hike took in pretty good. The silent auction we had last year did pretty good, and our bricks are still selling. If you need any Fremont County bricks for your gardens or anything, we still have those. Postage, not the postage, the post office box manages to go up every single year. We did purchase a drone. Chris and Brandon are the two that are licensed to use it. But we thought that it would be very helpful, things outside of the museum that we participate in, you know, to get footage of that. We purchased the banner for our group. And just, as you can see, odds and ends, first time I've ever had it go on to another page. But we ended up with $42,688.79. Some of that, of course, is savings, and we're hoping to spend some good amounts this year again on the museum. Have to get with Lisa and see what's high on her priority, and then after we hit her up, we hit Brandon up to see what he needs. And we just need more friends and appreciate all the participation that you guys do for us. Thank you.
If you haven't upped your membership for this year, it's due, and you know who to go to, and it's really reasonable. If you've had membership with anything else, you'll realize ours is very reasonable. I would like to have a motion to accept the treasurer's report. Who said that? There. Okay, Ann Zielinski said that. And a second? All right, Chris, second. So it's been moved and seconded that we should accept the treasurer's report. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Same sign. And at this time, we're even ready with an audit report briefly. Who would like to do that? Would you, Terry?
Distance. For a single sentence. Ann Zielinski and I met on January 18th of this year to audit the books that Paula had presented, and all monies were fully accounted for, and all deposits, expenditures, etc. So we certified the audit for this year. Thank you.
And just for a little while, I kind of like to mention some of the things we did. Actually, we always seem to have quite a meeting, and when I leave, I think, wow, we did quite a bit. So I'm not going to say about all that, but a few little things. We partnered with the Western Interior Paleontology. Perhaps you are aware of this. And that was to present the discovery of large fossils in our area. We partnered with them to also give a good program. It was pretty much a day-long thing at the Steeple Event Center. That's one of the biggies and one of the most exciting things that has happened recently. We offered the sesquipedential banners and backdrops for sale, and some of that showed up on the Treasurer's Report. We still have some Royal Gorge bricks. They're not making them anymore. And I want to just mention to you, yes, they're great around your flowers. They're great holding up my books, too. So you might want to purchase a couple. We hosted a junior paleontology program, and we had over 50 attendees. And so perhaps we'll have some young people that are now in our schools be our future paleontologists. And at the last senior mini college, which I might just plug in, is coming up again March the 18th out at PCC. But at the last one, we manned a table. And it was on Resource Day. And there were 6 different classes offered by those from the museum. We did participate in the 4-H craft and fair, which was recently. Terry, that you just heard from, she continues to amaze me as she uncovers many ways that she can help you to seek out your genealogy. I don't know what she's going to come up with next. It's amazing. And her classes are presented on Zoom. And we took a tour of EDSS out there at Penrose. I think, how many of you were there? We had a lot of people. I think we were all surprised. It's actually an international business. And my goodness, as good as we take care of horses, I wish we took care of some of the children that well. So that's just a few of the things that we did. And now I know why you're really here, not to hear me, but to find out more about what our researchers, Shari and Debbie, have found. I guess you've worked how many years?
By now, 2.
And when I call, you're always working on it.
That's right, and she's always at my house.
So, anyway, that is good, and I think they gave you a handout about the cattlemen and the cattle ranchers and the cowboys at our heritage, both in our county and next door. So please welcome both Shari and Debbie.
Yes, thank you, Jerry. I also like to thank Lisa and her staff for all the help that they've given us as well with all of our research that we have done and with the equipment that we're using today. So one of the things I wanted to share most of all is what I've gotten out of doing this research with Shari. And that is the importance of sharing your memories, sharing your stories. That's because of the many pioneers in the past. If they would not have shared and written down their stories, we would not know our past. So before it's too late, what I want to make sure is for you to document, write down, and tell your story. So for now, we'll start our program, and I'll turn it over to Shari. Gotta get my reading glasses on. I'd like to echo what Deb just said. We want to thank you for this opportunity to share more stories about the cattlemen, their ranches, and the cowboys in our area. And of course, you know, these people, these cattlemen and the cowboys, they all knew each other. Even though we cover several counties, they all knew each other. We're so very grateful for authors such as George Everett, Paul Huntley, Harry Epperson, and Vic Miller, who preserved history by writing about their experiences, their times, and the stories they heard. Wendy King is one of our members, and she shared with us some Western magazines, in which one of them had one of Vic Miller's articles. It was a story of Charlie Terry, a Coaldale, Fremont County cowboy. And of course, we had to make sure that Charlie's name was in our collection. I'd like to read you a portion of this short story, since my words cannot replace those of Vic Miller's. A few of the old cowboys of the first cattle herds in the Wet Mountain Valley and the upper Arkansas River Range were still around when I arrived in Colorado in 1921. Among them, the most interesting one of my acquaintance was Charlie Terry. Charlie's date of birth and location was not known for certain. In the late 1870s, the Eddy brothers from near Carlsbad, New Mexico, began bringing Texas longhorns on trail drives through the San Luis Valley to a place they claimed northwest of Black Mountain in Park County. This place became the Vivian Ranch, one of the larger spreads in the region. They ran as many as 8,000 head at one time. And you may remember that Charles Bishop Eddy finally became mayor of Salida. Now, Charles Terry was on one of the Eddy brothers' last trail drives. He joined them near Fort Garland when only 14 years old. This was the beginning of his life as a cowboy. In time, he became one of the best bronc riders and expert ropers in this area where he spent a long life. When he was 55, he was still riding broncs. When near 60, he was watching bronc riding at a small rodeo at Westcliff, when some of the boys who knew him of old suggested he show the crowd how he used to do it. After some kidding and bragging on him, Charlie agreed to ride. He made as good a ride as was made there that day. Now, most cowboys swing a large loop when roping cattle on the range, but not Charlie Terry. He had mastered the art of throwing a small loop at close range. This was a great advantage in timber and brush country, which is where he did most of his cowboying. Back before 1920, he was helping to gather remnants of a herd that had been sold off, the last of the old rangy Mexican cattle. He jumped a couple of them in the head of a long draw that led down to the river near Coaldale. It was steep and brushy. Charlie headed down the draw and soon dropped his loop over the lead steer's horns. Instead of jerking up the steer, he just tightened the loop and raced on until he was beside the other steer. Then he flipped a half hitch over the other steer's horns and led the two of them down to the river valley. This was a feat that had been seldom duplicated. Another time, Charlie caught a longhorn cow by one horn, and he quickly flipped a half hitch over the other horn and held her. Much later, when he was 81 years old, I was staying at the Antelope Cow Camp north of Texas Creek. Terry and Ray Zabriskie were also staying there and gathering cattle from the range country toward the river. One evening, they came in after dark. Charlie told how he had caught the last of the wild bunch that afternoon, an old longhorn that the cowboys had been trying to catch for several years. She ranged around Table Mountain and Bull Gulch to the east.
This day, Ray had Charlie wait at the top of the steep trail while he scared her out. After a time, Charlie heard Ray far down the trail yelling. He made his loop, and he waited out of sight. When the cow came out on top, she stopped to get her breath, as Ray had been pushing her hard. Charlie dropped his loop on her horns before she could take off. She hit the end of his rope, swapped ends, and came back green-eyed. He expected this and raced to a tree where he tied her up until Ray arrived. Charlie lived a few more years after that, but it may have been the last wild one he ever roped. It's not known what year Charlie came to the area. He settled on a homestead on Little Cottonwood Creek a few miles south of Coaldale. Soon after his arrival, he brought 150 head of horses from the San Luis Valley over Hayden Pass. He probably had help moving that many over this pass, which was little more than an Indian game trail then. I was a pallbearer at Charlie's funeral. I'm glad I arrived in this part of the West in time to become friends with cowboys like Charlie Terry and a few others I knew that were on those long trail drives when they were just boys. As a side note, Charlie Terry is buried at the Hillside Cemetery, 1867 to 1951. Well, here's a fun fact. Texas longhorns have the habit of hiding in the brush during the day and doing most of their foraging at night. Now, they might come out sometimes in the daytime when the mosquitoes are out in full force because they hope to find a breeze. Well, this explained a lot to me. You know, when I was reading about roundups, these cowboys were always getting the cattle out from underneath the brush. I just didn't know that it was their habit to hide during the daytime. Another fact that I came across in reading was that it's been said at the peak of the cattle boom, some 40,000 cowboys worked on the open range, a majority of them white Southerners, many of them former Confederate cavalrymen. We're going to move over to Chaffee County and the John Burnett Ranch. We picked this one out because what's been written about it really does shed a little bit more light about early pioneer life. John Burnett was born near Ottawa, Canada. At the age of 20, we find him in Napoleon, Arkansas, acting as an overseer of a large lumbering business. He later went to Iowa, and he engaged in farming for a year. He came to Colorado by covered wagon in 1861. That's one of our earlier pioneers. He, Harrington, and the McPhersons, and you may recognize those names, came through Fort Dodge, Kansas, all together. Now, most of them had ox teams, but Burnett had a mule team. The government had held him up there at Fort Dodge until there were enough in the group to go through to protect themselves from the Indians. John Burnett first settled in California Gulch up at Leadville. He worked in a sawmill and later he mined. He was the discoverer and one of the owners of the property later known as the Star Mining Company in Lake County. Well, he sold his interest in that property in 1865, and he homesteaded a ranch 3/4 of a mile west of Poncha Springs, and that's just west of Salida. He engaged in farming, stock raising, and mining. Now, also in that area was John Tennessee, an Italian. He had settled near the mouth of the Little Arkansas River. Now, Colorado, and I've also heard him called as a sub-chief, but some call him a chief, formed a great dislike for John Tennessee, and he ordered him to leave the country. John Burnett and Charles Knocktrebe, you may remember that Nathrop was named after Charles Knocktrebe, they bought John Tennessee's cattle, and that was really the first herd over there in that valley. John Burnett also served as an Indian agent. In 1866, he constructed a log building on his ranch to serve as an Indian trading post. He also built himself a log cabin. He lived there for a couple of years. It had a large fireplace with iron hooks hanging down where they hung large iron kettles for cooking. In 1868, he built himself a 2-story home, and he married Sarah Minerva Maxwell in Helena Lake County. He and Sarah had 7 children. Emma Helene Smith, a granddaughter of John Burnett, describes the family's life with Indians as follows. The Ute Indians were a warlike tribe and held their own with fierce Arapahoes of the east and the savage Cheyennes of the north, whether upon mountain or plains. They were generally quite friendly toward the whites. They had a disgusting habit of ranging all over the state, stealing horses, killing off game, and carelessly firing force in the dry summer seasons. Governor Hunt left Denver to make a peace treaty with the Indians, but ran into the Arapahoes at Fairplay and had to turn back. He sent word to John Burnett to issue supplies to the Indians. About 2,000 Ute Indians, hearing of the governor's message, arrived one morning for their supplies. While waiting, about 1,500 camped at the mouth of Little Cochetopa, and 500 near the mouth of Poncha Creek. After receiving their supplies, they spent 3 days gambling and racing horses on the land where Poncha now stands. Some of the Indians traded buffalo hides, buckskin, and other Indian treasures for their provisions. Some other important Indian chiefs besides Colorado were Ouray, Chavano, and Captain Jack. The settlers never had any trouble with them, but always felt uneasy. Well, the Burnetts also held church services at their home. Early day ministers and bishops, regardless of faith, is the way I interpreted it, would hold the services in the Burnett home for the benefit of the area's settlers. At different times, John Burnett served as county treasurer and county commissioner. In 1878, John Burnett was accidentally shot on a hunting trip near the foot of Mount Chavano. He had started to pull his gun out of his pack, and it discharged. He was buried in the Droney Cemetery, but later his remains were moved to the Poncha Cemetery. Virginia McConnell Simmons, in her book, The Upper Arkansas, mentions the possibility that perhaps John's death might not have been an accident, as there were some deaths at the time of the Lake County War that were questionable. Sarah Burnett, the wife, stayed on the ranch and managed it admirably until her death in 1924. She held the distinction of being the first teacher in the Poncha Springs School. Her picture appears in the book Representative Women of Colorado, published in 1911. Under her picture, it states she was a student in the Colorado Seminary in 1866, taught Pioneer School in Poncha Springs in 1867, and introduced horticulture into Chaffee County. Sarah had planted a large apple orchard on their property in the 1880s, the first in their valley. Apple wood was used to smoke their meat. Well, we mentioned that they had 7 children. Of these, there was a set of twins, Albert and Alfred. They were born on the ranch that had been homesteaded by their parents. Alfred married Emma Westberg in 1910. She had been an art teacher up in Fort Collins, and they moved into a new home just east of the original home on the same ranch. They had 3 children who all attended school their first 8 years in Poncha Springs, where their grandmother was a teacher. Now, Bert never married. He had been crippled as a child. It was difficult for him to get around. So he continued to live in the family home after his mother passed away. Different families would live with Bert from time to time, some serving as housekeepers, others just doing the ranch chores. The Burnetts and the Hutchinsons had a cow camp on Marshall Pass where the cattle grazed on the range during the summer months, and they were brought down in the fall to be fed through the winter. In the early 1940s, the Forest Service closed the range to the cattlemen, and they were forced to find other pasture. Alfred took care of the farming along with riding for cattle. We have this photo here. This is Albert. This is Alfred. We also have Charles Knocktree, Bailey Hutchinson, Tom McQuaid. They were all attending a cattlemen's meeting in Denver. Alfred had a blacksmith shop on the ranch. He made a lot of his own tools. He did work for the neighbors, shoeing horses, sharpening plowshares. They had a slaughterhouse. They butchered their own beef in the winter. They butchered hogs in the late fall, smoked hams, bacon, ground sausage, and rendered lard. Steers were shipped to the Denver Union stockyards by rail, and in later years, when the trains were discontinued, they were shipped by truck. Alfred passed away in 1945. He had served 12 years as a county commissioner for Chaffee County, a number of years on the Poncha School Board, 3 terms as state representative for Chaffee County, and 10 years as a water commissioner for both Lake and Chaffee counties. Emma, his wife, stayed on the ranch until her death in 1950, and Albert passed away in 51. Now, Alfred and Albert held the distinction of being the oldest twins in the state who had never been separated through the years and who had lived on the same place all their lives. Moving up to Lake County, we kind of stretched this far because the Elkhorn Ranch, also known as the Hayden Ranch, involved the Hayden family, a prominent family back in Coaldale here in Fremont County. Now we've got a map up here. We're going to be talking about Mosquito Pass, Leadville, the Hayden Meadows where the ranch was, Twin Lakes a little bit, and south to Granite. The Elkhorn Ranch is located about 10 miles south of Leadville. Probably a lot of you have actually driven past it. And it's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It is one of the most important early agricultural operations in Lake County. The ranch has had many notable owners. It already existed in 1860. And that's about the first of the timeline when we start talking about ranching and cattlemen. That's that first decade. That was the year that the miners had streamed into California Gulch up there at Leadville to pan for gold. And back then, that's when it was known as the Elkhorn Ranch, and it was owned by Benson and Company. The elevation of the ranch is about 9,200 feet. It had a short growing season, but it had plenty of water, and it could be used to grow hay for horses and mules. Around 1864-65, Father John Dyer acquired the Elkhorn Ranch, and it was renamed the Dyer and Harrington Hay Ranch. Now, John Dyer came from a family that had immigrated to the United States from England. He was born in 1812 in Ohio. His father was a justice of the peace. He had a background in farming and mining. He had married Harriet Foster. They had had 5 children when she suddenly died in 1847. Also, one of those children, an infant, had died too. He left the mines, and he eventually followed a calling to become a Methodist circuit rider. The children were left in care of his sister Rachel, and some of them in their later years made their way to Colorado. In 1864, he was offered the opportunity to supplement his income, and he would carry the mail between Buckskin Joe and Leadville for $18 a month. That route required a weekly trip over Mosquito Pass. It has elevations of 13,000 feet. In winter, he wore Norwegian snowshoes, which were really skis. This allowed him to preach 3 or 4 times a week, attend to the mining camps, and then to carry the mail weekly. In 1868, he sold a half interest in that ranch to his son, Elias Dyer. We mentioned in our last presentation the Lake County War actually started near Centerville, which is now in Chaffee County, but it used to be in Lake County. And a good number of residents suffered ill effects or died because of that war. The McPhersons, the Haydens, and the Hutchinson families were in that area at that time. Father John Dyer makes the following statement in his autobiography, The Snowshoe Itinerant. Now, I want to explain. He was asked many times to escort people who had wanted to cross over Mosquito Pass with him. He knew the trip was too hard. He would decline their requests. But this instance, he did acquiesce and evidently agree to do this. He states in his autobiography, "A man came up from Denver and we had a hard trip. He begged me to stop. On top of the range, he lay down to sleep, and it was with difficulty that I could get him up. I knew if he went to sleep, chilled as we were, he would never awake until the judgment. We finally reached Oro City at breakfast time. That man was one of the leaders of a mob that caused the death of a number of better men than he was. One of his victims was my son." In 1871, Charles Mader, who later became prominent in Leadville, was the new owner of the ranch. But a year later, Olive Hayden became the next owner. Eventually, her brother Francis, or Frank as he was called, acquired the entire acreage, and it became known as the Hayden Ranch. The Hayden family owned that ranch from 1872 to 1933. If we take a look at Lewis Hayden, the patriarch of the Hayden family, he was born in 1817 in Elkhart, Indiana. He and his wife Margaret traveled to Colorado City in 1862, again one of those earliest pioneers. Their greatest fear while traveling was prairie fires and buffalo stampedes. They ran cattle on what was later known as the Broadmoor. They had settled in Bijou Basin, northeast of Colorado Springs. But that turned out to be an unhappy place for the Haydens. 2 of their children died there. A son-in-law froze to death there. And there was an Indian raid at their home, and son Chauncey grew up with a great fear of Indians. In 1864, the Haydens left that ranch with their livestock, and they moved to Granite. We find Lewis Hayden mining in 1869. He built and operated the first stamp mill in that area. He even expanded his mining operation over to Washington Gulch, north of Crested Butte. In 1880, it was there that he was struck with a paralysis. Now, Lewis Hayden was a Lake County commissioner during the Lake County War. He had felt the ire of the Committee of Safety, and this may have influenced the family to move to Coaldale in 1882. So back to Frank, when he took over the Elkhorn Ranch, this began the intensive development of it. They had Arkansas river rights dating back to 1877. They raised hay and cattle for sale in Leadville, Denver, and other markets throughout Colorado. For 20 years, the family focused on producing hay. They expanded the ranch to 3,500 acres. The Hayden Ranch was said to have served as a stagecoach stop along the former Twin Lakes Toll Road. Frank and his wife Molly ran the ranch until their deaths. They had one daughter, Nellie, and Nellie married a ranch hand, John Weir. Eventually, John and Nellie inherited the ranch. In 1877, a silver boom started up there at Leadville. The hay and the cattle from the Hayden Ranch helped to sustain those area miners. Over 2,000 cattle were raised on the ranch during the mining boom. In 1880, the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad built a siding at the Hayden Ranch on its way up to Leadville. That provided them an easier access to the markets. At its height, the ranch yielded 3,000 tons of hay per year on 2,000 acres. It's been said that some of the hay was hand-sorted for quality and even shipped to the royal stables in England. There were 4 or 5 hay barns in the ranch meadows all at one time. And there was even a one-room school called the Hope School on the ranch for 10 years. In the 1890s, the same mines that needed the Hayden Ranch agricultural produce were also the cause of its demise. Since the Hayden Ranch was downstream from Leadville, the water it used to irrigate its hay and other crops contained pollution from Leadville's toxic mine tailings. By the early 1890s, the pollution began to affect both the quantity and the quality of the hay grown at the ranch. But all during this time, peat moss was dug, sold, and shipped from the many bogs that were on the ranch. With the repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act in 1890, and then a national economic panic in 1893, many of Leadville's mines closed. It ended much of the demand for the ranch's produce, and it should be noted that the ranch had employed many of the area men. John Weir expanded the ranch's operations beyond hay so it could survive. He moved the ranch into the livestock business. We have some slides of the ranch buildings. First up, the headquarters, then the bunkhouse, one of their barns, and its interior. Each spring, John Weir would buy a group of 2-year-old steers that would graze at the ranch during the summer before being sent to Denver in the fall for sale. He installed a water wheel that powered a sawmill, and also it powered a stationary hay baler. In 1933, the Hayden family sold the ranch to the Callahan Construction Company, and after that, the ranch changed hands many times. Now, coming back to Custer County, we had a request to present something about the Cook family. My paper clips are falling off of this podium. We find that Custer County is exceedingly friendly to us, but we also find that actually there's been very little written about the ranching up there. We plan to do some personal interviews with families that are still up there, try and research those families and do more. So this is just a brief sketch of the Cook family. Frederick Cook immigrated from Germany to the United States with his wife Elizabeth and 4 sons, Conrad, Peter, Fred, and August. And we have a photograph of August up here with his family. Frederick Cook came to the Wet Mountain Valley with the German colony in 1870. He homesteaded and he owned a grocery store in Silver Cliff. Now, some of the stories that have been printed and rumored about the Cook family, son Peter would drive a freight wagon from Silver Cliff to Canyon City to pick up supplies. Another son, Fred, rode his horse into Slappy's Saloon in Westcliff and right up to the bar. The bartender expressed his unhappiness at the situation, and Fred answered him by taking out his pistol and shooting the pipe out of the bartender's mouth. And a final story is that it was surmised that maybe August, the youngest son, had had some difficulty finding himself a wife. His parents went to Germany, and they brought back a wife for him. In 1889, August, age 23, married Mary Knoll, age 21. They went on to have 12 children. During the Depression, the Cooks built a dance hall on the ranch down by the road. They had a band featuring August's daughter Elda on piano, Ray DeWall on saxophone, and Eddie Cody on banjo. The first dance at the dance hall was held to celebrate the wedding of August's son George to Virgie Shugart. Now, the Cook family was known to be very enterprising. Not only were the family members involved in general farming, but Helmut Cook owned a highly improved property where he had a dairy operation. The Cook family operated several sawmills. They furnished the mines in Silver Cliff with timbers and wedges. Also, the Cooks sold ice to cool rail cars used for shipping out the vegetables from the valley. They grew hay, and they delivered it by team and wagon, sometimes as far away as Leadville. Another Cook, George, was the operator of the Cook Ranch, a centennial farm, which ran commercial Hereford cattle and registered bulls. Now, bringing it right back home here to Canyon City, we're presenting Frederick Reynolds. He was born in 1860 in Canton, Ohio. For 40 years, his father had been engaged in merchandising back there in Ohio. Two of his great-grandfathers were soldiers in the Revolutionary War. Both of his grandfathers were in the War of 1812, and he had 4 brothers who were in the Civil War. Frederick quit school at age 16. He became a clerk at his uncle's dry goods store for 3 years, and that was David Zollers and Company, and that family name will come back here again. He then tried the butter and egg business, and he failed financially. In my own thought, I thought, how could you fail? But he did. Frederick became a traveling agent for the Eagle Woolen Mills of Canton. Later, he became the manager of those mills, and he held that position until he came here to Colorado. Well, in June of 1874, he and Frederick Reynolds, Frederick, and his brother Jefferson came to Canyon City for the purpose of starting a bank. Now, Jefferson was 7 years older than Frederick. He had served in the Civil War. He had become a clerk in the First National Bank there in Canton, Ohio. But in 1866, we find him out here in Denver working as a bookkeeper in the Colorado National Bank. Later, he moved to Pueblo, where he formed a partnership with Thatcher. Now, this is the older brother, Jefferson, and you recognize the Thatcher name. And he organized the First National Bank, and he became its cashier. He married Martha Cowan in Pueblo in 1871. Frederick and Jefferson opened up the Fremont County Bank just 3 months after arriving here in Canyon City. In 1877, we find that Frederick is president of the Canyon City and San Juan Railroad Company. It had been organized for the purpose of getting a railroad through the Grand Canyon West. The building of the railroad was actually done by the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad Company as lessees of the Canyon City and San Juan Railroad Company. The success of the Leadville mining operations had hastened the construction of the railroad to that point. In 1878, Frederick started opening up branch banks. Leadville, Buena Vista, Alpine, Swatch, Silver Cliff, and Rosita. And the family name again, John Zollers, was cashier of the First National Bank of Leadville. At this time, Frederick was the silent partner of Zollers, Eshelman, and Company of the Lake County Bank. But in less than a year, he became president of that bank. That's when it changed its name to First National Bank. At this time, he was only 29 years old, and he was president of a national and 2 state banks. As a side note, Jefferson, Frederick, and another brother, Joshua, had organized a private bank down in Las Vegas, New Mexico. Jefferson was president, and then later, Jefferson and Joshua formed the First National Bank of El Paso, Texas. Well, in 1880, Frederick married Magdalene Sheets. And a few years later, Frederick closed out all of those branch banks that we mentioned, and he concentrated his business interests right here in Canyon City. We have a street scene of here in Canyon City with Frederick Reynolds. We believe this is Frederick and his wife Magdalene. If someone else knows differently, please let us know. That was furnished by the Denver Public Library. Frederick Reynolds acquired large interests outside his banking business. He had large cattle interests. He organized the Reynolds Cattle Company, which was capitalized with $500,000 in the late 1880s. The home ranch was in Garden Park. He was the owner of the Canyon City Flouring Mill, which had the capacity to produce 200 sacks of flour daily. The Fruitland Ditch was constructed with Henry Earl, and in partnership with C.B. Kuntz, they had a 50-acre orchard east of Canyon City. Frederick owned vast amounts of city property and at one time was the largest real estate owner in this county. In 1890, Governor Cooper had appointed him commissioner of the penitentiary and of the Buena Vista Reformatory. Well, Frederick was an active member and an elder of the First Presbyterian Church, a 32nd degree Mason, a member of the Modern Woodmen of America, member of the Canyon City School Board District for 6 years, and at the time of his death, he was serving his second term as president of the Colorado State Bankers Association. He was known to be very charitable and philanthropic. In 1906, he passed away at the age of 56 from pneumonia. His wife, Magdalene, became the sole owner of all of his property. The assets of the bank were already over $1 million, and his life insurance was added to that. Magdalene served as president of the bank until her remarriage in 1913. She sold at that time most of her stock to George F. Rockefeller, who was cashier of the bank. A quote by Elton Beckworth regarding Frederick Reynolds. I have known F.A. Reynolds since he first came to Colorado in 1874, and have done business with him all these years. I found him the squarest man I ever knew, and absolutely sincere in everything he said or undertook. In review, we've pointed out that many of the ranchers and their wives were leaders in their communities. Also, many of them looked upon cattle as an investment. In the book Cattle Kingdom by Christopher Knowlton, he states that by some accounts, total investment in the cattle industry in the mid-1880s exceeded the capitalization of the entire American banking system. Now, just for a fun fact here at the end here, there are an astonishing number of ways for a cowboy to get hurt or killed. You could fall from your horse, be kicked in the head while roping a steer. You could be gored by a horn, drown while crossing a river, be caught in quicksand. You could be struck by lightning, scalped by an Indian, or shot by a wrestler, or be involved in a ballroom brawl. And that overlooks the less than fatal but uncomfortable perils of the job, such as the torment of mosquitoes and horseflies, untreatable maladies such as sunstroke or sun blindness, infections, sprains, food poisoning, and piles. Doctors were scarcer than Latin scholars on the range. Any questions, any comments? Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And now we'll have a test. Actually, this does close our program time and our annual business meeting, and you are most welcome to stay and speak with our people here and enjoy some refreshments. Thank you again for coming.